If your apartment walls could talk, what do you think they'd say? Well, in New York City, every single layout tells a story, not just about who lived there, but about the city itself. So let's dive into how the history of New York is literally written in the floor plans of its most common homes.
It all kicks off with a simple and, yeah, kind of weird question. Why on earth would you ever find a bathtub in a kitchen? The answer, it turns out, isn't just about some quirky design choice. It's a clue, a breadcrumb, that leads us back over 100 years into a city of unbelievable contrasts.
So our story starts in the 19th century, as Manhattan was laying out its now famous street grid. It was also, without really intending to, creating the blueprint for two completely different kinds of homes, for two completely different kinds of New Yorkers.
On one side of the coin, you have the brownstone. This is the iconic row house you picture when you think of the Upper West Side or Harlem or parts of Brooklyn. It was the absolute residence of choice for the city's growing upper class.
Every little detail of the brownstone tells you something about life in the 1800s. That big, grand staircase out front, the stoop, it wasn't just for looks, it was a super practical way to rise above all the horse manure that filled the streets. The shared party walls on either side meant light could only get in from the front and back, creating that signature long, narrow feel. And the fact that there were no back alleys, well, that's a big reason why New York still piles its trash right on the curb today. And this all goes back to the city's grid plan from way back in 1811. The planners created these really long 200-foot blocks. Then they sliced them in half to make 100-foot deep lots, and then they chopped those up into these narrow 25-foot wide parcels for building. And here's a fun fact. If you add the street and the block together, 20 of those equals almost exactly 1 mile. That grid is literally the DNA of Manhattan architecture.
Now, on the complete polar opposite end of that world was the tenement. This was housing for the working class and a huge wave of new immigrants. Their defining feature was what's called the railroad layout. To get from the front of the apartment to the back, you had to walk through every single room, just like on a train. Privacy was, not really a feature.
So here's the bottom line, the really crucial point. This unbelievable contrast. The brownstone was a big, single-family home designed purely for comfort. The tenement? It was built for one thing and one thing only, maximum density. You'd often find entire families crammed into a single room. It was two different worlds living side by side on the exact same city grid. The conditions were just awful, so dire that reformers like Jacob Riis had to expose them in books like How the Other Half Lives. A lot of these rooms didn't even have windows, and the overcrowding was a breeding ground for disease. Something had to change.
And it did, with the Tenement House Act of 1901. This new law said that every single room had to have a window for light and air. This created these new buildings shaped kind of like dumbbells, with these skinny little air shafts running down the middle. Of course, the shafts usually just filled up with garbage. The law also required indoor toilets, and here it is, the answer to our mystery. The only place to add a bathtub in these tiny apartments was in the kitchen, right next to the plumbing that was already there for the sink.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. We're moving into the early 20th century, and there's a new professional class emerging. And a single invention was about to totally change the New York skyline and create a whole new way of living just for them. I want you to meet the Classic Six. You'll find these in the grand pre-war buildings of the Upper East and West Sides. This was the absolute dream apartment of the 1920s, and it had a very specific layout of 6 rooms that reflected a very specific lifestyle. You can basically read the social rules of the time right from the floor plan. You'd enter through a formal foyer. The kitchen was tiny because, well, it was seen as a workspace for the live-in maid who had her own tiny room nearby. The dining room was formal and separate, strictly for entertaining. And get this, very little closet space. Why? People just owned way less stuff back then. So before this era, apartment buildings almost never went higher than 6 stories. Any idea why? It's actually super simple. 6 floors was the most anyone was willing to climb. Then came the passenger elevator. This technology was a complete and total game changer. It suddenly made it possible to build 10, 12, even 15-story residential buildings. It absolutely revolutionized urban density. All right, let's jump ahead again to the mid-20th century. New York is changing big time. Manufacturing is starting to move out of Manhattan, leaving behind these huge, empty buildings. But where some people saw ruins, artists, they saw a canvas. And this is how we get the loft apartment. Now, these places were never, ever designed for people to live in. They were industrial spaces. A lot of them were in these beautiful cast iron buildings, which was a type of construction that allowed for massive windows, just flooding these huge open floors with natural light. In Soho, which just means south of Houston Street, was ground zero for this whole movement. At the same exact time that these spaces were becoming empty and cheap, art itself was getting physically bigger. Artists weren't just painting on easels anymore. They were creating massive works that needed huge studios. Soho Goths were the perfect solution. And the evolution of Soho tells such a classic New York story. In the 60s, artists started moving in, a lot of them illegally. In 1971, they fought for the artist in residence law to make it legal. But of course, as the neighborhood became this cool, vibrant arts hub, wealthier people moved in, prices shot through the roof, and eventually the very artists who made the neighborhood desirable were pushed out. A tale as old as time in this city. Okay, for our final apartment, we're going to look at a classic case of, well, stolen identity. Because the word studio means something completely different today than it did a century ago. I mean, just look at the difference here. It is night and day. Today, when we hear studio, we think of a small, one-room efficiency apartment. But the original studio apartments in buildings like the famous Hotel des Artistes, they were palatial. We're talking multi-room, double-height residences with enormous windows, built for very, very wealthy artists. So what happened? Well, the real estate industry co-opted the term. Studio just had this romantic, bohemian vibe that sounded a whole lot better than efficiency apartment. It was a brilliant marketing move that completely redefined the word, using the allure of the artist's life to sell the smallest, most basic way to live alone in the city. So from the tenement to the loft, each one of these layouts was a solution to the economic and social needs of its time. And it really makes you wonder, as this city continues to change, what problems will the New York City apartment of the future be designed to solve?